Okay, so our next speaker, Heydon Pickering, the ever clever Heydon Pickering, the person who came up with incredible ideas that we didn't know we needed, but now we use them every day. Who knew we needed the owl selector, right? Now we all need the owl selector. Who knew we needed quantity selectors, the things I showed you last year? Those were not my idea, those are his idea. He comes up with all this super clever stuff. All these things that we want and that somehow we could do for years, he found out that we can. Right now, he wrote a book about accessibility a few years ago. Can I ask the people in the back there at the stands to please shut up? So he wrote a book about accessibility, and right now he's in the final phases of writing his second book about accessibility, which can only be fantastic, right, like all the rest of the work that he's doing. There is, of course, a big downside to this incredible talent when it comes to writing stuff and doing stuff with the web. And that is that right now he doesn't have any time to make music. Because if you look for his music, that's incredible. That's even better than his CSS. So please give a very warm applause to the person who came to Amsterdam to draw a crab onto my car, Heydon Pickering.
Thank you very much. Oh, I can hear myself, but I can't see my slides. It might be my machine, actually. Yes, it is. Okay, cool. Whoops. I'm glad that Andy was talking about art direction earlier, because when I started writing this talk, I decided I was going to art direct it. And what I've done is in the first, what I tried to do was to have a number for every slide. So the number was significant, and that would be how I'd recollect doing something. You'll notice, however, that when I get about 5 or 6 slides in, that I ditched that idea because it wasn't sustainable and just thought, fuck it. And now it's just going to descend into just a sort of a mess after that point in about 5 minutes, I would say. So just to quickly, Heydon works on Twitter. I work with Smashing Magazine. I've got a new book coming out with them called Inclusive Design Patterns. And I work with the Paciello group as well, who are an accessibility consultancy. If you meet someone who's an accessibility expert, chances are that that will be a Paciello group person. So I'm very proud to be working with them. So my first number is 2003. Who was making stuff in 2003 for the web? About a third, maybe nearly a half of people. I wasn't making stuff for the web in 2003, although I should have been. I did something a bit more random. I was at a university in the UK. It was the 69th most prestigious and highly rated university in the country. Not so much a place of learning as a Costa coffee shop with a built-in captive audience of debt-accumulating zombies. So I was there, and just recently, just that week, my friend, my housemate, had given me a zip disk. Does anyone remember zip disks? They're like armored floppy disks, right? And they had something between 100 and 250 megabytes on them. And on that zip disk was a copy of Macromedia Flash version 3, a cracked copy, an illegal copy. And even then, actually, that was an old version because everyone else had moved to the, I don't know if you remember, MX, which was, and you had to do it like that. And the next number 1 represents the hit single by, I want to say, the problematic R&B singer R. Kelly. He had that at the time. Problematic's probably the best way of putting that, isn't it? R. Kelly had a hit single with the song Ignition, a song which was designed to appeal to children with its onomatopoeic use of car noises like toot and beep. Tooting is also a British slang, which means to inhale heroin through a makeshift foil tube after lighting the heroin underneath. This is something I saw a 12-year-old girl do on the station platform in broad daylight in Hatfield, which is where I was studying, so I've come back to the university bit. And someone had helpfully prefixed, or namespaced, I suppose you might prefer if you're into that sort of thing in programming, the name Hatfield with an S. So it read Shatfield. And shat is, if you're not familiar with the English, is the past participle of shit, which was apt because if you actually did a shit in a field, you'd essentially have that town. That was how that town was planned. So for all of these reasons and more, I, in 2003, was not enamored with contemporary consumer society and the world around me in general. I was quite upset with it. I couldn't really be bothered to finish my university degree. I couldn't be bothered to carry on with it at all. But before I left the university, I wanted to take all of this stuff, all of this anger towards the world and towards capitalism, etc., and turn it into a big political art statement. So I was studying digital media, which was essentially a graphics course, but it included animation and things like that. But I wanted to be an artist, and I did something where I wanted to attack and make a point against, first of all, the politically impotent and navel-gazing high art at the time. So there was sort of this rubbish installation art and stuff like that that we were getting, sort of Brit art and things like that, which I had no time for whatsoever. I think that artists should be intellectual leaders. They should give us something to hope for and aim us towards something. This was just self-obsessed, cult of the personality sort of stuff. Simultaneously, I was upset with the commercial patronage and co-option of art, the way that there was commercial interest and sponsorship of art. And that was partly responsible for why we were getting such low-quality, depoliticized artists in the art world as well. So what I did was I formed a marketing partnership with my friend David. We went around telling people in the business world, went to trade shows, and told those people that we are marketing gurus, that we are great thought leaders in the world of marketing. And of course, naturally, all of those people that we met went, yeah, we know you, we know you. Of course, we'd completely made this up. The closest thing we had to a business was that we got a joint account at the bank, like we were married. But these people bought it, and we ended up working for some interesting people. But we were working for them as a conceptual art project. So this was all just research for our degree. And the biggest statement we did at the end of the year was that we took our names, prefixed it with sponsored by, and in massive 6-foot-high lettering, we had that plastered across the front of the art faculty building. This was a big glass front, which was at least as high as this ceiling in here. We prefixed it with sponsored by, the implication being that our company, our fake company, was sponsoring the art faculty and the university, which was not true. So we really upset the genuine corporate sponsors of the university because no money had changed hands. Simultaneously, we really upset the fine artists who were working there because they had the privilege above the lowly graphic designers and digital media people of displaying their installation artwork, that crap that I really didn't like, in the front foyer. Now, the art faculty faced east, so when the sun came up, what happened is our names literally were projected across all of that artwork inside that faculty building. So they were not happy whatsoever. Now, whilst I was at university, and I was there for 3 years, I was supposed to be, and I was spending a lot of my time just writing music, but aside from that, I was supposed to be learning desktop publishing. There was Quark, and there was InDesign, things like that I should have been learning about. I didn't, because I was dicking about, pretending to be a marketing person for some reason. Animation, I should have learned that. There was stuff like Flash and stop-motion animation, and I was supposed to learn web design, but I didn't. All I was really doing was this monumental dick move against all of these people who I didn't like, although I think some of them were legitimate targets. But I got a first. I got a first-class degree, the highest grade you can get. And the reason for that, despite that I didn't meet any of the objectives that I was supposed to, is because, as it turns out, I'm quite good at post-rationalizing things, coming up with weird ideas, and then actually being able to say, well, there's a reason for this, and maybe it can actually work. And that's when I found out that I wasn't really a designer or a digital media. We don't use the word media anyway anymore, do we? But that I wasn't really a designer. I was really kind of a writer, although I do think that those two things cross over quite a lot. So eventually I did come to the web. But I came to it kind of as a writer, and somebody wanted to publish things, and it excited me because the potential audience was huge, and the outlay was so small. Obviously, I didn't have to spend much money. And it's simple virtues about the web like this, which is if you put content into one space, and then you change the shape of that space and the content reacts automatically, that really excited me, because that meant that that stuff could reach all of those different devices and all those different spaces. And you can do that without CSS. The web is responsive before we even use CSS. So this talk is kind of a love letter to HTML, so I want to start at that point. What HTML also does is HTML gives us structure. It gives us semantic structure. So you can include things like headings, and you can include lists and all sorts of other things like that, block quotes if you want. And you can do that without CSS or without JavaScript. And in fact, without those semantic differentiations, you can't style the differences either. There needs to be something there. So that's a cool thing about HTML. When it comes down to it, of the three technologies, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, there's only one where you can actually send something to the browser and it will do something for the user on its own. You can't just send JavaScript to the browser and it will actually give an experience to a user. And if it is only just writing that you're sending, just plain text, but it's good writing, you can actually change someone's life. You can actually move them, which I think is a really powerful thing. And it doesn't matter really if that was in Times New Roman. The only reason we worry about it being in Times New Roman is because we think that they'll think, oh, they've forgotten to, they don't know how to write CSS, or they've broken their CSS or something like that. But, Times New Roman's an all right font. There's nothing wrong with Times New Roman. It's just not expected to be there anymore. So HTML differentiates content, and it also helps us interact with content. In fact, it's the only way we can interact. It's the fabric of the interface, if you like. And if we think about how to construct that interface in a sensitive and inclusive way, that means that more people can interact with it more easily. And in fact, JavaScript and CSS are really the only, they only really depend on HTML. We use libraries and things like jQuery, but actually the only dependency for those two things is HTML. So HTML is like the foundation. So when people say, oh, I've got this pure CSS solution to something, I think it's fair enough to troll them and say, oh, really, there's no HTML involved. That's, wow, you've done that well. So when I learned CSS, moving on from HTML, I learned it through things like CSS Zen Garden, which I'm sure by raise of hands, do people remember CSS Zen Garden and they've used that? Of course, yeah, everyone remembers that. And the thing that I took away from it that I thought was really interesting and really important is that you could formulate a semantic, accessible, interoperable structure for a document, and then you could choose the style for it. And you could be really, really expressive with that style. You can do your art direction that Andy was talking about, sound in mind, so that you've already got a sound structure underneath. So methodical on the one hand and expressive on the other hand, and that's why the separation of concerns is quite an important thing. So in a way, we could be doing HTML first design. We could be writing the HTML and then being expressive with our CSS and then adding behavior with JavaScript. But we don't do that. And that's sort of a cultural thing. That's not a lack of talent or an ignorance. I guess we all know that that's possible. It's more of a cultural thing. And we're in this situation here where we sort of arbitrarily divided into people who are called designers and people who are called developers. And you kind of have this situation where a designer will make a visual artifact of how they believe the website should look, and then the developer, or the front-end developer more specifically, will try and realize that in code. And to do that, we need to be really expressive, because naturally the design is going to the visual design that the designer came up with in the first place is going to be it can be quite complex and not defer to the sort of semantic structures that you might have considered as the front-end developer. So we need this way of kind of plugging those gaps. And the class selector is really, really useful for that, because it allows us to author our own styles and come up with our own semantic systems. So we love classes. We use classes all the time. But unfortunately, what it can allow us to do, and I'm not blaming the class for this on its own, but what it can allow us to do is to sidestep this bit where we should have been thinking about the underlying semantic structure, which has all sorts of benefits to whether it's for being compatible with screen reader technology, or allowing us to actually restyle things and make our content more portable and syndicate it. We can go from the proposed visual design to a an exact pixel perfect in inverted commas version of it in code without ever really thinking about what the right elements were to use and what their relationship should be. So what we're effectively doing is taking the HTML, which is a foundation, tearing it off like that, and attaching it crudely to the top of the stack like this. Sorry for the violence in that diagram. And what we're doing is we're relying on frameworks which necessarily are abstract libraries which do not make decisions for us about the structure of our documents. They can't do that because they don't know what we're actually making. And we're taking those things and we're building through them, and then we kind of worry about whether actually the structure that's sitting on, that layer is sitting on, actually is working for our users or not. And that's when we get into this ugly phase that accessibility consultants like myself, when I'm wearing that hat, call remediation, which is a sort of jargonistic way of writing reports which itemize all of the different things that have gone wrong. And they're really boring to write. I hate writing them. And they're really not very nice to read either, obviously, because you're just looking at this going, oh, God. And then the work to actually fix the problems is really, really, really boring too. Problems like this. This is from some examples where I've been looking at websites recently, and I've had to audit them for accessibility. You've got a library which offers you a class for headings, and of course, it's easy then to use it on any element, because a class can be put on any element. Unfortunately, the div is a semantically inert element. It does not provide the semantics or the behaviors to assistive technologies, for instance. Also, if CSS is not available, it won't be styled as a heading using the user agent styles. So it's not a robust way or an accessible way of making a heading. So, of course, I have to write a little ticket and put that in my report. Things like this, where you take away the list items. You think, well, that saves it as perf, right? Because if you take out the list items, then there's less code going into the page. But of course, it no longer parses as a list. So for instance, if I was using the JAWS screen reader, it would no longer enumerate the list items as I approach the list. It also have some parsing problems in browsers where it wouldn't display correctly in places as well. And this classic one, of course, which is where you're making a button, but you use both the wrong element and you forget to include an href, which means it's not keyboard accessible, which I see every day in my job, which is amazing. Joe Dolson, who's brilliant, wrote an article, I'm an accessibility consultant, stop hiring me, which I really highly recommend you read, where he talks about how we've got into this culture where we keep writing these reports and saying, well, no, actually, a link isn't a button, etc., over and over and over again. And we'd rather not be doing that, because it's not like there's a talent deficit. It's just a question of culture, as I said, and we've somehow sidestepped that. And what he says he'd rather do is just include inclusive design and accessibility in basic training, and then it's part of your design process. So we can fix this situation, I think. So first of all, what we need to do is training, as I say, workshops, and it just being a part of our culture. Then HTML in the design process. So I think that HTML should actually be something we think about really early on when we begin to design things. It's not just something that we think, oh, I've got all my styles, I've got a vision of what I want to do, I'll just find some arbitrary divs to attach that all to. So if we actually think about the way that HTML works, the interoperable states, and the kind of elements that we can take advantage of, which already have the behaviors that they should, like you'd use radio buttons instead of trying to construct something inaccessible out of something else. So thinking about HTML early, because HTML may as well be a design tool. It's no different from Sketch or knitting needles or a lathe. If you can be a designer with HTML. And then this weird idea I've come up with, which is test-driven development, but for HTML, which I'm now going to talk about. So this is a test, and I'm not a huge test-driven development expert, but this is the kind of thing I would write when I'm writing something in Node, which will take a function that I've written and then just fire that function out using, I'm using Mocha and Chai here, but it just runs that function and see if it actually gives you an expected result. Now, the idea about this, and the great thing about test-driven development, is that you are thinking about you're writing tests as you write the actual production code. So it's forcing you to reason with what you're doing as you're doing it. To put it another way, it helps you move from that didn't work as expected to that didn't work as expected. So because you've written the test there, oh, okay, I see why that doesn't work now. So that's a really powerful thing, and I see it a lot more these days, and I think it's cool. But it tends to be for imperative languages. Now, I know JavaScript, you can kind of write functionally in it, but what I mean is programming languages, right? So it's kind of for writing you write a function to test a function. Whereas declarative languages work differently. But you can do declarative test-driven development for HTML, I think. And as it turns out, imperatively testing imperative code obviously makes sense, but declaratively testing declarative code is the best fit naturally for HTML. So you need something declarative to test the declarative code. And as a bonus, hopefully you'd want something which had no extra overhead, so it wasn't a huge library that you had to import. It was well supported across different platforms and different browsers, and it knows HTML really well, so it can express the structures of HTML. It can understand them. As it turns out, CSS is really good at that. So CSS offers us selectors, and selectors are logical. They sort of work almost in an imperative fashion where you're testing against something and it will return true or false. So button square brackets disabled means a button and has the disabled property or the disabled attribute in HTML. And it will honor the styles for anything which matches that. And you can use that to write tests. So the first approach to this is what I call the whitelist approach. So this is where you'd be looking for, or you'd be trying to enforce the right HTML through your CSS. And I'll show you how that works. So your first example here, you've got .btn, which is a class. Now that class, as we know, can be used anywhere. It can be used on buttons, it can be used on block quotes, it can be used on antiquated layer elements, or whatever you want to use it on. Which is a slight problem because it means it can be used wrongly, and there is such a thing as a correct button and an incorrect button. Now, if you qualify that .button class with the button element selector, then that will only apply to actual button elements. And we know that button elements are keyboard and screen reader accessible, and also they look like buttons even where CSS fails, so they're robust. It's like a safeguard. It stops you styling things in a deceptive way. And I know, I'm going to get onto the qualification thing because I know that's an ugly problem with this. So already, when you look on your screen and you're using this class in the wrong place, it won't style it anymore. If you use it on a div, it will come out in your Times New Roman, and you'll see it's a visual regression that tells you that your underlying code, your HTML code, is wrong. Now, so far, it doesn't actually give you an error. It doesn't return an error to explain what you've done wrong. But we're going to talk about that later. But it's a start. And actually, at eBay, they've written their entire CSS framework using selectors which actually test for the correct HTML. They use elements, they use attributes, they use all sorts of things to make sure that the CSS only applies where it should, which I think is pretty amazing at a company of that size when most people have moved to using BEM and SMAX and that sort of stuff. But there are serious problems with it. It bloats your production CSS. So I guess if you're thinking about these selectors as tests, then those selectors are part of the code that gets sent to the user. And the selectors get really long, right? Because they are logically testing for certain parameters and certain things which are present in the HTML. Unlike using a class where it's just something you've defined that you place and it's terse. It precludes a methodology. You can't really do that and do BEM. That would be crazy. And it would bloat it even more. And it complicates specificity, obviously. If you're using an element with a class, that's higher specificity than just using a class. Gets even more than that if you're using attributes, which have the same specificity as classes, and it goes on and on. So there's big problems with this way of doing it. So instead, there's this blacklist approach. Whereas a blacklist approach is looking for things that shouldn't be there in your HTML. I wrote something called Revenge CSS, which is it's just a style sheet full of selectors. Each one of those selectors matches HTML. You don't want to be there, and it rewards the designer by printing an error to the screen using Comic Sans on a pink background. Hence, Revenge. Ali.css here is a much more complex version and does more or less the same thing. And it's actually quite amazing because it's written entirely in CSS, but it functions and is as extensive and comprehensive as a accessibility testing tool, which you would normally expect to be written in JavaScript as well as CSS. So that's pretty amazing. And I'm not involved in that, although actually a couple of the styles from, a couple of the selectors from Revenge went into that on a pull request. And here's how that works. So this selector now at the top is looking for something you don't want to see there. So if you've got an ordered list, then the direct children inside that element should not be anything but list elements, right? Because then it's not going to pass, it's not going to be accessible, whatever. So then you hook into that and you use pseudo content, and you first of all style that pseudo content to look like an error, and then you just use the content property to write that error to the screen. And I actually, when I wrote about the Revenge library, I got this comment from someone. And he's pointed out, I don't know if he's referring to me as stupid or he's saying it's stupid or just stupid, but he was concerned that this library I'd made had correctly identified errors in his code. Stupid that you get a warning for any element you try to make, buttons, icon fonts, etc. Sure, it is useful when you want to make a very simple, and it says it page ... Now, I haven't truncated that, he's just trailed off. But I did try to be helpful. I said, interesting, what is the HTML for your buttons and your icon fonts? And fairly predictably, he wrote mainly Bootstrap HTML like that. And he's even linked, he's helped me there by giving me a link to it. Of course, I wasn't going to get into that conversation. That's a huge framework. I'm not going to try and fix that. So naturally, I replied, I've never heard of it. Anyway, I digress. What's great about this blacklist approach is that we're moving away from having our kind of test code in our CSS to having it as a parallel line. So we can actually, we've got a testing style sheet, and we've got a main style sheet like our production CSS. So that means we can still use methodologies in our production CSS like BEM if we want to, but also it's not as bloated too. So that's good. But there are still limitations here. I mean, these libraries are just for finding generic errors. And what we really want to move towards, I think, is if it's real test-driven development, would be to actually write errors against our own code. So it would recognize idiosyncrasies that we'd put into our own code. It's sort of after the fact, too. And what I mean by that is that it's something you use to test. It's like a diagnostic tool you use after you've done the design. You make it, and then you press the button. I mean, Revenge was like a bookmarklet. Press the button, and then you get all these errors all over the screen. You're not writing the tests as you're writing the code. And there's a precedence problem as well, of course. If there's 2 errors for one element, then naturally the cascade means that only one of those will display. So one of the declaration blocks will be overridden by the other. And I also noticed that it was really difficult to get my errors to display well over the top of the host design, the parent CSS, if you see what I mean. Things would overlap, or there'd be overflow hidden, or that kind of stuff. But then I thought, what's the point? You don't even need to write errors to the screen. You don't actually need to write errors to the screen or style them or worry about their styling whatsoever. What you can do instead is simply use a very unobtrusive style, like an outline style, which does not affect layout, and just highlight the element that's got a problem with it. And then all the developer would have to do is click on that element using their inspector, using their DevTools inspector, and they would see the error in the console. So it's sort of like in Node, you would see errors obviously coming up in your command line. You would use, in a similar way, you can just use your DevTools styles panel, I guess is what I mean, which is where you'd see this. So hence, you can see I've written display none there. And I don't have to worry about the styling because it's just turning up in DevTools. But I can take that one step further with CSS's error property. It's a purpose-built property. It's just for doing this. It has no effect on rendering whatsoever, so I don't have to display none it. Does not require a string value like content, so I don't actually have to encapsulate the error in single quotation marks. And there's no precedence problem. Who here knows about the error property in CSS? Good. I thought someone was going to raise their hand, because like Ryan here and Steve, Carl, and Stefan, it doesn't really exist. I just made it up. Which is really cool, because then in my Chrome developer tools, I get a little free warning icon with my error. Because it has recognized that it is an unrecognized property. So I get that for free, so that's nice. But unfortunately, it also does this, which makes it a bit unreadable. I mean, it's still readable, I guess, but I get migraines easily, so that's not so good. So then I thought, oh, well, okay, so I can take this a bit further, and maybe I'll try and find a way of just targeting these error properties and styling them differently. And that was a little tricky. Basically, I had to get DevTools out and then get another DevTools window out and use the inspector to inspect the inspector, and went around in circles quite a bit. But eventually, I discovered some CSS which did the trick, which basically looks a bit like this. And what I've done is I've had it so that it appears kind of like the sort of error you would expect to get when you're doing imperative programming in your command line in your terminal. And if you want to use this slightly crazy technique that I'm talking about, then Dan helped me by making a custom DevTools theme, which is available here. And you can simply install that, and then you've got your red errors. And of course, you'll notice that the little warning symbol's still there, because it's nice, it's transparent PNG or SVG, hopefully. I'm hoping they're using an SVG there. So, now at this point, you're probably thinking, I'm never going to use this is a crazy idea. Or perhaps you're thinking, oh, okay, well, that's quite interesting, and I might actually use that. In any case, let's just talk about CSS selectors for a bit, because I like them. And we're going to use a tab interface as an exemplar for how this might work in an actual design and development flow, okay? So, let's imagine you've got a module, so it has a tabs.html, which is your tab panel HTML stuff. The .js for the behavior. Your tabs.css, which is actually how it should look. And then I'm using this convention of tabs.test.css for my test code using the weird error property. And the reason I'm using that convention is so that when I'm doing a build, obviously I can exclude any file which has .test. So star test.css or what have you. This is kind of what the HTML looks like. I'm not going to talk too much about that now, but it's an accessible tab interface which uses way area. So it has a role tab list, role tab, etc., all of that good stuff. So let's look at some tests. Here's the first rule. So already, I'm writing stuff against my own code. I know that my tab interface is going to have the block selector of .tab interface on the outside. And I know that inside that should be a list element, and that should have a role of tab list. So this matches a list if it doesn't have that role. So that will produce an error. So that's a good start. Rule number 2, role equals tab list, A, not role equals tab. So all of the individual links inside that tab list should have a role of tab on them. Otherwise, it will not function properly when run with assistive technologies. Rule number 3 is to make sure that all of the list elements inside that tab list have role presentation. Now, the reason for that is that if I'm using the links to do the tabs, they already act as a kind of list. When I focus one of those tabs, say using VoiceOver, it will say tab to 1 of 3 or something like that, which is kind of how lists work anyway. So what you do is you take away the semantics of the list, because that just gets in the way. So role equals presentation means, I think some people think it means to hide the element, but actually it just means take away its semantics, so it doesn't say anything more than its content. So that's there. Rules 4 and 5 are to do with focus management. So the selected tab, which is denoted accessibly with ARIA selected, should have a tab index, should not have rather a tab index of -1, because it should be focusable by the user. Tab index -1 means it can be focused with a script, but it can't be focused with the tab key. You should be able to tab to that tab and tab past it if it's the active tab. Tabbing to the tab is a bit of a mouthful. But all the other tabs, the inactive tabs, should have tab index -1, because you should only be able to access them with the arrow keys, up, down, left, or right. So we make sure that both those things are in place. Rule number 6, the tab panel should not have, I'm trying to read this now, ARIA labeled by. Okay, so you need to label each panel by its tab. That's one method of labeling them, but it's the easiest way of doing it. The reason for that is if you enter the tab panel either from above or below, it will announce the label for contextual information. Or hourly, I mean, if you're using a screen reader. I've used, again, I'm writing to my own idiosyncrasies and to my own code like I would do with traditional test-driven development. I've decided I want to use a convention where the ARIA labeled by relationship to the tabs starts with tab. So you get the hat symbol equals in the attribute select to say that. So all of the tabs should have an ID of tab something. Rules 7 and 8, just to finish up, we don't want to get any other markup inside our tab interface between the tab list and the tab panels, because that would just complicate things and wreck it, basically. You'd get things you go from a tab, you think you're going into a tab panel, but actually you're stepping in and focusing something else which is irrelevant. So it's just to make sure that nothing is somehow got in, and that sort of thing happens easily, doesn't it, when you move things around. So there you have it. And then you put it all together. You put it all in one declaration block like this, just using commas. You've got your outline style there to show where the errors are. You might want to use an important on that, I guess. It doesn't matter. You're not going to send that important anywhere where anyone's going to see it and laugh at you, because it's only in your production CSS anyway. And then you just start writing the errors using the phony error property like this. And yes, you can still BEM, which is good because Stefan really likes BEM. And you can even test to make sure that the people you're working with on your team are adhering to the BEM syntax that you want. So for instance, this will return an error if you're not inside a block element using an element that uses a double underscore. And another cool thing you can do is if you're using data attributes to change state in your interface, you can make sure that they come along with the accessible equivalent, if you like. So ARIA expanded is used to denote accessibly that a state is changing one way or another. So wherever there is data toggle, which is something that I just came up with, there should also be the standard ARIA expanded in place. So to recap over all of that, this is a sort of visual way of doing testing. We're not just looking at stuff in a terminal or expecting something to be automated. And I think that's good because I think a lot of us we're not programmers or designers, we're somewhere in between, and we do a lot of coding, but it results in visual work. We're working visually. So the visual regressions represent structural and semantic coding problems. It's tailored to your own code, so as I said, you write things in your way, and then you write tests to make sure that it remains that way, or if it doesn't remain that way, that people know about it. And it makes you reason as you're writing things too, like test-driven development. But also, I think most importantly, it communicates intent to other people that you're working with. So if they are changing your code, and then suddenly they start seeing errors, they can inspect, what's this red outline for? They can inspect that, and they can read the error in the inspector, and it will tell them what's wrong with it. And then they can either fix it, or they can have an argument with you about how they would do it differently. Now, I don't think, actually, a lot of us are interested in doing this anymore, and some of us have moved away from doing this thing where we do a visual artifact, and then we go straight into trying to make a pixel-perfect design afterwards. We're moving more towards, as Andy was mentioning, this kind of thing where we do living style guides and pattern libraries of working code. I think that's a great thing because that means that we're modular, we can take things in out, and we can dynamically compose pages. So what I propose to you is that with a little bit of this test-driven HTML, you can iterate in such a way that you can catch problems. So you take the code base at one state, it moves along, and suddenly these red errors appear. There's something there to tell you that it's changed in a way that might have broken it for accessibility, but also it might have broken with your in-house style conventions and things like that. So at that point, the developer who has it in their hand, the person who's broken it, can either rewrite the tests, because sometimes, you know, when it changes significantly in test-driven development, you have to rewrite the tests, of course, or just fix it, go back. They can make the same changes they wanted to change, but without screwing it. And then you can move on with confidence. One last thing. I was speaking to my friend Rodney Rem, who was the technical editor on my new book, and we got talking, and he's a lot smarter than I am. He's taken what I've done, this work with these CSS tests, and he's created something which automatically just takes those selectors and turns them into actual unit tests. If you want to go down that road, then you can. I don't think I will, because I don't quite understand it. But that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And there I am on Twitter and all of that shit.
Thank you so much. That's so clever. I really, really, really like how you take lessons from other disciplines, like from test-driven development, which is, well, a lot of people know how that works and they use it every day, and it's really proven that it works well, and that you just translate it to our own profession, which I think is fantastic. And I have this question. You were talking about HTML first design, and I've done that a lot. I've worked with many agencies, and that I started with the HTML proper structure and then added some styling. Then I asked the designers the old school Photoshop designers to please start improving it. Mm-hmm. And then they just come up with some fantasy. And ignore the structure, ignore everything that I started with. So I think that somehow, and it's also have to do maybe with marketing, that we have to sell our stuff to marketing. It's really easy to sell bling bling and beautiful animations to marketers, but how can we make accessibility more sexy? Do you have an answer to that?
Yeah. Sexy, difficult. Ethical is one way of looking at it, but the way I like to think of it is, I mean, the reason I'm into accessibility is not because, not to be like holier than thou or anything like that, it just genuinely interests me. I think it's a really interesting design challenge to make things work for different audiences. But I think we get into the mistake of thinking of accessibility as working for screen readers or not breaking keyboard use, when actually it can mean all sorts of things. And there's so many people who benefit from stuff which does work, say in screen readers, who aren't blind or don't use a screen reader because they have a reading disability or something like that. So for instance, using alternative text on images, that helps people if they're viewing things non-visually, but it also means that the content is indexed better in search engines. And it also means that if you turn off images to save bandwidth, that there might be something in certain browsers there to tell you what the image is about, so you still get that content. So you can save money because of alternative text. So it works in lots of different ways for lots of different people in lots of different circumstances.
Okay, not sure if my marketing team will be convinced now. They'll still pick the bling bling, I'm afraid.
Yeah, probably.
Are there any questions in the audience for Heydon? Or are you all very hungry right now? Because up next is lunch. I'm not sure if lunch is served yet. We can, of course, peek around the corner. So, yeah, well, there is a question here. Good. Oh, there's a microphone over there.
Oh.
Thanks. Hello. So, yeah, at the end you show how we can make unit tests out of that. I quickly show that it's using Phantom.js, right? On your
Probably.
Slide? Okay. Well, do you know if there is some grunt or gulp task tool already available to automate it?
Oh, no, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I showed this to Rodney, and he went, "Oh, well, why not just go the whole 9 yards?" And I mean, it's working differently doing it as unit tests, because then it's moving away from being the same sort of visual hands-on way of doing it. But he did it in his own way, and I'm not entirely sure how he did. But I'm sure there's probably, I mean, you know what NPM is like. I'm sure there's somebody who's done something to do with CSS selectors and parsing them via JavaScript or via Node in some way, I guess. So, although I don't think he did it that way, I think there is a way of doing it. I think he involved Phantom.js in there somehow. So, yeah, that's all I can tell you. I'm not sure, actually.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, cheers.
Are there any other questions? No?